Quote, "Good morning. Has your bank been robbed yet?" End quote. The Wolf Point Herald asked that poignant and sarcastic question in its October 21st, 1927 edition. If it was North Dakota, South Dakota, or Montana, the answer was quite possibly yes. Yes, it has been robbed. Two of those involved in bank heists in that area were Richard Brumfield, the alias of Clarence Reed, who was set to plead guilty to robbing the Bowman County Bank. He was dragging Lester Barge, involved in a host of robberies, down with him as well in doing so. Brumfield confessed that he was associated with Barge for the robbery of the bank at Gascoigne, North Dakota, in Bowman County. That heist occurred on August 12, 1927, during a summer-long frenzy of robberies. Brumfield agreed to plead guilty to third-degree burglary and was set to be sentenced on the upcoming Monday. These are the types of bank robbers and gangsters that we cover here on Decades of Gangsters, from 1926 to 1941, when the United States enters World War II. Brumfield said that he and Barge were two-thirds of a trio. The third member went by Dave, with Dave's last name being unknown. He said he was, quote, "a fool for aiding in the robbery," end quote, and that he wanted to get a lesson which he seemed destined to get. 4 days later, he was sentenced for 3 to 5 years in the state penitentiary by Judge F.T. Lemke. The Wheelock murder mentioned earlier was part of a robbery that we covered in our November 1926 video titled "Non-Bank Robber Robs Miami, Florida Bank." In the Gascoigne robbery, they scored a, quote, "diamond lavalier, a ring, a watch, and $7 in money," end quote. They were unsuccessful in accessing the safe, which allegedly contained a large sum of money. Meanwhile, Lester Barge was still being held in Williams County in connection with the murder of H.N. Peterson, bank cashier of the Citizen State Bank of Wheelock, North Dakota. As noted previously, Barge was also wanted in Minnesota in connection with the murder of Isanti, Minnesota Sheriff Darlene, which we covered in the video Death and Money in May 1927. On October 28th, the Wolf Point Herald blasted two important stories on its front page. Jail delivery plot spilled. In the parlance of the day, a, quote, "jail delivery," end quote, was when a gang member would be freed from jail by members of his gang through force. Sure enough, the story was subtitled, "Williston Officials Hear of Plentywood Plot to Liberate Inmates." Right below it ran another story, "Dakota prisoners saw out, barges are secure. 3 men held for various thievery charges successfully escaped the Williams County Jail by, quote, sawing window bars," end quote. 10 other prisoners refused to partake in the escape. Fortuitously or due to clear thinking, the Barge brothers had been locked in a separate cell and never even had a chance to escape. A story from the Great Falls Tribune noted that, quote, "additional heavily armed guards," end quote, had been placed around the jail in Williston after information leaked to authorities that a gang of men had congregated in Plentywood, Montana. That special guard consisted of veterans of, quote, "the World War," end quote. Well, that gang that had congregated in Plentywood, Montana, were allegedly making plans to attempt to free Barge. Still, North Dakota authorities were considering moving Barge to another jail within the state. Lester Barge was set to go on trial in early November for that H.N. Peterson murder. Acting in the same orbit and possibly working together on a job or two was August Schumack. The Bismarck Tribune picks up where we left off in the video The Dakotas Under Siege in September 1927, and they pick up with August Schumack's story. The article was titled, Schumack to stand trial at Lemoore and was subtitled Man Suspected of Complicity in Verona Bank Robbery being held in jail. The Farmers and Merchants Bank in Verona, North Dakota had been hit on September 6, 1927, during which approximately $4,000 was stolen. One of those allegedly involved? August Schumack. Schumack was being taken to Lemoore from Aberdeen, South Dakota after South Dakota officials released him. They'd been trying to connect him with a flurry of bank robberies that had occurred in South Dakota. Schumack, held under a $10,000 bond, was also awaiting trial in November. Like Barge, Schumack had connections to the Twin Cities, he having been captured in Minneapolis, Minnesota in September of 1927. 4 days later, he was taken to the Barnes County Jail at Valley City, North Dakota for, quote, safekeeping. He'd been under guard in Lemoore County Jail since his return from South Dakota, but Sheriff N.J. Cruden determined that the jail was, quote, inadequate to take care of the man, end quote. Valley City Jail, however, required no special guard, so it was the safer bet for authorities. The Bismarck Tribune offered up a different angle for the Verona bank robbery story, focusing on the murder of bank cashier Hans Bjorn. We covered Bjorn's story in Gunfire to the Gallows, Gangster Crime Wave and Justice, which was another September 1927 video, but we weren't familiar with one Francis Tucker at the time. Tucker was being charged with murder in the first degree and was going to go on trial on the upcoming Tuesday in November. Tucker had been indicted twice before by a grand jury in Lemoore, North Dakota already. Evidence on which Tucker was indicted included the fact that he allegedly spent, quote, considerable money the day following the murder, end quote. During both appearances before the grand jury, Tucker stated that the money came from, quote, his not paying any of his creditors, end quote, instead saving that money up. An important update came out regarding Schumack as well. He confessed to driving the car for the bandits who robbed the Verona bank, though he denied any further knowledge of the heist. Brumfield, Barge, and Schumack were under the iron fist of the law, but a new gang apparently emerged that kept the frenzy of bank heists going in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana. On October 19, 1927, quote, Missouri River ferries were watched, end quote, and the citizenry was asked to keep their eyes open and to be on the lookout for 4 men who held up and robbed the Flaxville State Bank. They scored somewhere between $5,000 and $7,000 from the robbery that had occurred on October 18th. They were believed to be traveling in a blue sedan, the plates of which on the vehicle were intentionally covered in mud to obscure them. And it was thought that they would try to cross the river at one of the area ferry crossings. State Senator J.W. Schnitzler, whose bank at Froid was robbed earlier that month. He planned to head out by airplane for Flaxville to aid investigators. Well, the Poplar Standard ran a summary of both bank robberies in its October 21st edition. It was titled, Froid and Flaxville Banks Held Up, Bandits Escape. And this is how the heists happened. The First State Bank of Froid was hit, and the Flaxville State Bank about a week and a half later. 4 masked men entered the Froid Bank in the early afternoon. They covered employees and patrons with guns and scooped up the cash. The only trace was a Master 6 Buick sedan that was found buried in a large straw pile near Froid, a car believed to have been used by the robbers. It had been stolen from a Williston, South Dakota doctor the night before the bank heist. Chief of Police Monroe got word from Flaxville that the bank there had been held up. So Monroe called for volunteers, and several carloads of armed men headed out on the roads to find the crooks. It was learned that the robbers had headed east, which gave them about a 15 to 20-minute head start over their pursuers. They actually stopped for gas and then continued on east, stopping at some point to push a stalled truck from a bridge. Then they continued on in their black Hudson coach, that Flaxville job having netted them between $6,000 and $7,000. It was believed that the same gang had scored at both Froid and Flaxville. The Producers News out of Plentywood, Montana ran a headline emblazoned across the front page: "Banks looted in daylight robberies." This was big news, and the paper took advantage using a story title, "Bandits Make Rich Hauls in Roosevelt and Daniels," and a subtitle over 50 words long. An important aspect of the subtitle was that it was possible that the bank robbers also robbed a couple of farmhands of their season's earnings and then even crossed into Canada, robbing a Saskatchewan store of approximately $4,000. They may have even been partially responsible for a bevy of auto thefts and robberies in nearby Valley County in Montana. In fact, so many crimes were being attributed to them that there was even a case of mistaken identity, as covered in "Farmer Disguised by Cash Called on Carpet." Minot, North Dakota banks were on the lookout for people with large sums of cash. Soon after that notice was made, one bank called the police. Police then arrived at the bank to find a, quote, "stranger in rough clothes," end quote, at the teller window. The teller was just about to hand a $1,000 bill back to the stranger that he'd wanted to change into $5, $10, and $20 denominations. Incidentally, at the time, the $1,000 bill was nicknamed the Big William, or Big Bill, as indeed it was. Well, the teller stalled until the police had arrived by counting out those smaller denominations several times. Said stranger still had a big roll of small bills in addition to Big Bill. Police inquired of the stranger, who said that he had just sold his crop and auctioned his place, and even offered the police to contact a bank at Toley, North Dakota. So the police and the suspect headed to the courthouse, where they were able to place a call. They spoke with the banker at Toley, who actually verified the stranger's tale. He had indeed sold off everything and was heading back to South Dakota and had approximately $1,600 on him. He'd been warned of traveling with so much money, but figured no one would ever suspect him of having so much. Then, at the end of October, came another outburst. Had they returned for more, or was this yet another robbery combine? The October 28, 1927 Producers News went headline heavy, with one stating, "Bandits rob Outlook Bank and escape in fast automobile." Under that, the title, "Cashier Kester Says He Lost Over $2,000. Lastly, the standard Producers News mini novel subtitle, followed by a blazing summary, "2 North Dakota banks robbed in week." So here's what happened. 3 men dressed like farmers entered the Security State Bank in Outlook, Montana at about 10 a.m. One of the trio of robbers ordered a banker named Frank Kester and a clerk, Mrs. Philemon Rick, to step into the vault. Kester raised his hands and succumbed to their orders. Meanwhile, another of the robbers ordered several customers to stick their hands up. They too obeyed. The bandits then scooped up money estimated between $1,000 and $2,000, although later, after the robbery, Kester had closed the bank and did an accurate count and estimated the loss to be at just over $2,100. Well, the trio bolted outside to a car where one man had stood guard with the vehicle's engine running. However, they'd forgotten to turn the dial on the vault, thereby allowing Kester and Rick immediately to leave the vault and alert police. Meanwhile, a little boy had noticed something amiss at the bank and notified Marshal Goodlaxon. Goodlaxon arrived as the robbers were just starting to leave and opened fire, possibly breaking out the sedan's back window. The bandits fired back, forcing the marshal to find safety in the post office. Shots continued to pour out of the fleeing Chrysler sedan, piercing the post office walls in 2 cases and striking other businesses and houses along the street. Someone reckoned that they were traveling, quote, at a terrific rate of speed, end quote, possibly 60 or 70 miles per hour. But shortly out of town, the car abruptly stopped. At that point, the driver switched seats with one of the other passengers, the untold fact being that the driver had probably been struck by at least 1 bullet. Posses organized and 3 automobiles gave chase. Just east of town, the fleeing bandits grazed an oil truck and ran off the road into a ditch. Somehow the car was able to regain the road and they sped off, possibly heading for the Canadian border. The Canadian Mounted Police were notified. So the First State Bank of Froid was hit on October 15th for $7,000. The State Bank of Flaxville on the 18th for around the same amount of money. Well, Senator Schnitzler heard about the latest, this Outlook robbery, and once again headed skyward to join the pursuit. Meanwhile, new theories developed. The idea arose that the 2 groups of bandits who held up the Bank of Niagara in Grand Forks County and the First National Bank in Minnewacan, Montana, where they scored a total of about $3,500, were believed to have been the same crew. But was that crew the same as the one who hit the banks at Froid and Flaxville? Well, it appeared not. Authorities had determined that a duo hit one of those Montana banks and a trio hit the other. Those 5 gang members, or possibly more, probably met and started out from Minnesota. Supporting a lot of this idea was that a green Hudson coach used in the Bank of Niagara heist had broken down. Instead of fixing the car, 5 men gathered together and got into a Buick, leaving the Hudson in a ditch with its bearings burned out. The Plentywood Herald ran a well-written rendition but didn't offer any new information. However, the column next to it ran an editorial centered on Plentywood and the recent robberies under a title asking, "Wide Open Town?" The editor stated that if the town, quote, enjoyed law and order, end quote, the recent heists wouldn't have occurred. He noted that a criminal element had places to hang out and, quote, dives, end quote, in town and throughout the county. The editor came close to accusing the mayor and the town's council of borderline tacit approval of crime, including gambling houses, blind pigs, which is another term for a speakeasy, houses of ill fame, or brothels, and vagrancy. We started this episode with a quip from the Wolf Point Herald, so we'll end with another. A news story regarding the Froid, North Dakota bank heist thought that the robbery crew may have been the same one that hit the Sheridan County Treasury last fall, in a story covered in a previous video. Next Saturday, we'll check into some new robberies in Illinois and Arkansas, along with forgery and embezzlement, all occurring in the Midwest.